on scene for several hours that morning, including the defendant and his family. And during that time, officers and fire investigators were making efforts to determine how the fires might have started.
It was supposed to be just another quiet morning in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in New Jersey, the kind of place where enormous mansions sit behind long driveways, where families feel safe enough to leave their doors unlocked, and where crime feels like something that only happens somewhere else. But on November 20th, 2018, something about that calm silence felt wrong. Before firefighters even saw the flames, there were already clues scattered in the darkness of the night. A neighbor lying in bed suddenly heard gunshots echo through the distance, 5 sharp cracks cutting through the early morning quiet. At the time, no one realized those sounds were the final moments of a family's life. Hours later, when emergency crews finally arrived at a burning mansion on Willowbrook Road, the scene they stepped into would shock even the most experienced investigators. A body lying on the lawn, a luxury home completely engulfed in flames, and inside the ruins, the rest of the family. But what made this case truly disturbing wasn't just the brutality of what happened. It was who investigators would eventually discover was responsible. Because the person behind one of the most calculated family murders in New Jersey history wasn't a stranger. It was someone the victims trusted with everything. At first glance, the Caneiro family looked like the kind of family people admired from a distance. They had everything most people spend their entire lives working toward: a thriving business, a beautiful home in one of New Jersey's most peaceful and affluent communities, and 2 children who were the center of their world. Friends described them as hardworking, grounded, and deeply devoted to one another. The kind of family that seemed stable, successful, and happy. Keith Caneiro, the head of the household, was 50 years old and the definition of self-made. His story didn't start in luxury. As a teenager, he worked as a janitor at a computer store. It wasn't glamorous work, but it changed the course of his life. Being around computers every day sparked an interest that quickly turned into an obsession. He taught himself everything he could about technology. That curiosity eventually became a career. By the 1990s, Keith had founded his own tech consulting company called Square One. What started as a small venture grew into a successful technology firm based out of Asbury Park, New Jersey. But Keith didn't stop there. Alongside his work in technology, he also earned a real estate license and later completed a master's degree from Columbia University. People who knew him described him as relentless in the best possible way. He was ambitious, disciplined, and always looking for the next opportunity to grow. Standing beside him through it all was his wife, Jennifer. Jennifer was 45 years old, and while Keith was known for his drive and ambition, Jennifer was known for being the emotional center of the family. She was thoughtful, sharp, and deeply devoted to her children. Friends often said that while Keith built the business, Jennifer built the home. Together, they created a life in Colts Neck, a quiet township in Monmouth County, New Jersey. If you've never heard of Colts Neck, it's the kind of place people move to when they want privacy, space, and a slower pace of life. The homes are massive, often sitting on several acres of land. The area is famous for its equestrian culture, so much so that locals sometimes refer to it simply as horse country. Over the years, the peaceful landscape and sprawling estates attracted professional athletes, musicians, and wealthy business owners. And right in the middle of that quiet luxury stood the Caneiro family home. The mansion at 15 Willowbrook Road wasn't just large, it was stunning. Surrounded by trees and open land, it gave the family the kind of privacy many people dream about. Inside that home lived the 2 people Keith and Jennifer loved more than anything in the world. Their son Jesse was 11 years old. Their daughter Sophia was just 8. To Keith and Jennifer, everything they built was for those 2 children. The long hours at work, the constant business decisions, the financial risks, every sacrifice they made was meant to give Jesse and Sophia a life full of opportunity and security. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. But on the morning of November 20th, 2018, that dream was shattered. At approximately 12:38 in the afternoon, emergency dispatch received a call reporting a fire at the Caneiro residence on Willowbrook Road. Firefighters rushed to the property, expecting to deal with a typical house fire. What they found instead stopped them in their tracks. Lying on the front lawn was a body. Behind it, the massive mansion was already completely engulfed in flames. The fire was enormous. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze had been burning for hours without anyone noticing. The flames had spread so aggressively through the structure that crews struggled for hours to finally bring it under control. Eventually, the fire was extinguished. But the destruction left behind was staggering. The once beautiful mansion was now nothing more than a charred skeleton of walls and collapsed beams. And inside the ruins, investigators began making horrifying discoveries. Jennifer was found on the staircase that led down toward the basement. Jesse's body was located on the kitchen floor. Sophia was discovered near a landing on the lower level. All three had been killed before the fire ever reached them. Outside on the lawn was Keith. Autopsies revealed the brutal truth. Keith had been shot 5 times, once in the lower back and 4 times directly into his head. Nearby investigators found several shell casings stamped GFL 109 by 19, indicating they were from a 9mm handgun. Jennifer's death had been even more violent. She had been shot in the head and stabbed multiple times. The children had also been stabbed. And the most chilling detail of all came from the autopsy reports. Both Jesse and Sophia had signs of smoke inhalation. That meant they were still alive when the fire began. Whoever committed this crime didn't just murder the family, they tried to erase the entire scene. But as investigators continued examining the timeline of that day, something unusual began to emerge. Because 7 hours before the fire at the Caneiro mansion was reported, another fire had already been called in, and it was connected to someone much closer to the family than anyone could have imagined. Around 5 that same morning, nearly 7 hours before firefighters would discover the burning mansion on Willowbrook Road, another emergency call had already been placed. This one came from Ocean Township, about 20 minutes away. The caller sounded shaken. Smoke alarms were blaring and the house was quickly filling with smoke. Fire crews were dispatched immediately to 27 Tilton Drive, the home of Paul Caneiro, Keith's older brother. When firefighters arrived, they found Paul, his wife, and their 2 adult daughters already outside the home. They were sitting inside a Porsche Cayenne parked in the driveway, waiting as smoke drifted out of the house. Unlike the scene that would later unfold at Keith's property, everyone here was safe. No one was injured. Within about 20 minutes, firefighters managed to contain the blaze before it spread too far. At first, it looked like a routine house fire, but investigators quickly noticed something strange sitting on the driveway next to the Porsche, a red gasoline can. It wasn't just sitting there by coincidence. The outside of the container showed clear gasoline stains, and the smell of fuel was unmistakable. That immediately raised suspicion. Fire investigators began checking the rest of the property and eventually discovered a small storage shed behind the house. Inside the shed were 3 more gasoline cans sitting on a shelf, but the shelf had space for 4. One was missing, and it appeared to be the exact same red gas can that had been found next to the Porsche in the driveway. That detail changed everything. Investigators quickly determined that the fire at Paul Caneiro's house had not been accidental. It was arson. At that point, detectives shifted their attention to something that should have explained exactly what had happened that night: the surveillance cameras surrounding Paul's home. The property was equipped with multiple cameras that monitored the driveway, the garage, and the surrounding yard. If someone had started the fire, the footage should have captured it. When investigators asked Paul about the cameras, he told them they were welcome to check the recordings. But he added something odd. He mentioned that he might have turned off the recording system earlier because it was slowing down his Wi-Fi connection. That explanation sounded plausible at first, except for one problem. The cameras weren't connected to Wi-Fi at all. They were hardwired directly to a DVR system inside the garage. So, detectives reviewed what footage was available, and what they saw immediately raised even more questions. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, Paul Caneiro walked into his garage. He approached the DVR system connected to the security cameras, and then he manually shut it off. The cameras stopped recording right there. To Paul, it probably seemed like a smart move. If the cameras weren't recording, there would be no video of him leaving the house later that night. But what he didn't realize was that turning off the system created its own record. Investigators now knew exactly when the cameras had been disabled, and that timestamp would become incredibly important. Because while detectives were piecing together the timeline of the fires, another piece of information surfaced, something that had been reported hours earlier. At around 3 in the morning, a resident living about 3.5 miles from Keith Caneiro's home had called 911. The caller sounded confused but certain about what they heard. They had been lying in bed when the silence of the night was suddenly broken by gunshots. Not just one, several. The dispatcher asked if they were sure. The caller confirmed it. They had clearly heard multiple shots echo through the area. Police responded quickly, but at the time they couldn't determine where the shots had come from. The neighborhood was large, and without a precise location, there was little they could do. But later that morning, another neighbor came forward. They reported hearing 4 to 5 gunshots around 3:10 a.m. Now, investigators began comparing those reports with the evidence discovered at the Caneiro property. Keith had been shot 5 times, and witnesses had reported hearing 5 gunshots. Suddenly, the timeline started forming a clear picture. Sometime around 3 in the morning, someone had approached Keith Caneiro's home. They had shot him outside on his own front lawn. Then they had entered the house. Inside, the attacker murdered Jennifer, then turned on the children, Jesse and Sophia. After the murders, the killer started a fire in the basement, likely hoping the blaze would destroy every piece of evidence inside the house. But the fire alone wasn't the only strange thing that happened that morning. Just 20 minutes away, Keith's brother's house had also been set on fire. At first glance, it could have looked like both homes were targeted by the same unknown attacker. Maybe someone with a grudge against the family, maybe a random act of violence. But investigators weren't convinced. The gasoline can, the disabled cameras, and the suspicious timeline surrounding Paul's house fire made detectives believe something else entirely. They began looking deeper into the relationship between Keith and his older brother, Paul. The two had grown up together in Brooklyn, New York. Paul was just 1 year older than Keith, and by most accounts, they had been extremely close growing up. They supported each other, looked out for each other. Later in life, they both married women from Staten Island and eventually moved their families to New Jersey, settling just 20 minutes apart. Their bond seemed strong. In fact, Keith had even served as Paul's best man at his wedding. The brothers didn't just share family ties, they shared business. Together they ran 2 companies. The first was Square One, Keith's technology company. Keith owned 90% of the business, while Paul owned the remaining 10%. The second was a pest control company called Ecosystems, which the brothers owned 50-50. Both businesses operated out of the same building in Asbury Park. To outsiders, it looked like a successful partnership between 2 brothers who trusted each other completely. But behind the scenes, that relationship had slowly started to fracture. And the deeper investigators dug into the family's finances and personal history, the clearer it became that something far darker had been building between the 2 brothers long before the night of the murders. For years, the relationship between Keith and Paul Caneiro had quietly shifted. On the surface, everything still looked normal. They were brothers, business partners, and part of the same tight-knit family. But behind closed doors, the balance between them had started to collapse. In 2012, Paul was involved in a serious car accident that left him with lasting physical injuries. He underwent multiple surgeries and was left with chronic back pain and a permanent limp. The recovery changed his life. His ability to work normally declined, and gradually, he became less involved in the day-to-day operations of the businesses he shared with Keith. But even as his involvement decreased, the financial support continued. Because Paul was receiving disability benefits, the companies structured his income in a way that allowed him to still receive money without officially violating the rules. His salary, about $225,000 per year, was paid to his wife instead. For years, that arrangement held together. Keith kept the businesses running, and Paul continued receiving the financial support he needed. But by 2018, things had begun to unravel. Keith had started noticing irregularities in the finances. Money was missing. Payments weren't being made the way they should have been. The more he looked into it, the more frustrated he became. Employees later said Keith had been increasingly concerned about Paul's spending habits. Despite receiving large amounts of money, Paul seemed to constantly be short on cash. Then investigators uncovered something even worse. Keith had created a $3 million life insurance policy meant to protect Jennifer and the children if anything ever happened to him. That policy was placed inside an irrevocable trust, and Paul had been given responsibility for managing it. But Paul hadn't been paying the premiums. Instead, prosecutors later argued that he had been diverting the money for himself. Investigators discovered that Paul was having an extramarital affair and had been using large amounts of money to fund that relationship. He paid bills for his girlfriend, helped with her daughter's college expenses, and had even begun planning a new life with her in Florida. To hide what he was doing, Paul allegedly sent altered financial documents to Keith, making it appear as if the insurance policy was still active, when in reality, the payments had not been made for months. According to investigators, Keith eventually found out, and the confrontation that followed was recorded by Keith's home security system. The audio captured Keith demanding answers, asking for access to his financial accounts, and demanding that the deception stop immediately. Jennifer could also be heard in the background, pleading with Paul to come clean. The next day, November 19, 2018, Keith sent a critical email to business associates. In it, he made something very clear. He would no longer send any money to Paul's household until the missing funds were fully explained. For Paul, that moment may have been the breaking point. The fraud was about to be exposed, his salary was about to disappear, and the person who knew the truth about everything was his own brother. Investigators believe that sometime that night, Paul made a horrifying decision. If Keith and his entire family were gone, The life insurance trust could eventually fall under his control. The businesses would no longer be challenged, and the person threatening to reveal the financial deception would no longer be alive. What followed was a crime prosecutors described as cold, calculated, and deeply personal. Evidence recovered from Paul's car included parts of a 9mm handgun, a suppressor, and a thermal night vision device, equipment designed for moving through darkness undetected. Ammunition found in his home matched the shell casings recovered beside Keith's body. And perhaps most devastating of all, investigators found Sophia's DNA on gloves hidden in Paul's basement. The jury needed only hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of murder. Paul Caneiro was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia never had the chance to see justice themselves. But their story now stands as a haunting reminder of how betrayal can sometimes come from the very people we trust the most. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think this was purely about money and desperation? Or was it something deeper? Years of jealousy, resentment, and living in someone else's shadow finally exploding into violence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this case as shocking as I did, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys true crime stories. Because there are many more cases like this. Stories that deserve to be told, and victims who deserve to be remembered.